Salins. He's the University of Professor of Political Science at Stony Brook University. His articles have appeared in leading publications such as Commentary Reason, New York Times Magazine, Public Interest, The New Episode, and City Journal, just to name a few. The book is called The Smart Society, Strengthening America's Greatest Resource, Its People. Mr. Salins, welcome to today's issues.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, tell us about yourself a little bit, and then introduce us to the Smart Society.
All right. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Most of my research has been on different patterns of urbanism in New York and, housing policy and pretty much things that dealt with places. But for 10 years, I was the provost, that's the chief academic officer of the State University of New York, the largest public university system in the country. And all of a sudden I realized that we really need to worry a lot about how we're dealing with our greatest resource, the American people. The job of the university is to, strengthen the capability of young people so they can go out in the world and become successful. I saw all aspects of that issue in my job. I saw that the teacher training programs we had weren't doing a good job training teachers. I saw that a lot of the students in the State University weren't properly prepared to go to college. I saw that a lot of the theories that were being used in the public schools weren't working. I saw that even though we were doing a lot of great research at the university, that we could be doing a lot more, and we could be increasing the vitality of American businesses with better technology. And then, I've been interested in immigration for a long time. My last book was on immigration. It was called Assimilation American Style. And I also felt that our immigration policy wasn't what it should be, because immigrants are among our strongest human capital resource. So I decided when I left the State University, I'm going to write a book on human capital, because human capital is what I think it's all about, that our country is as strong as the people in it. We've always had the highest level of human capital in the world. This goes back hundreds of years. I don't know if people realize it, but the United States was the first country in the world to make public education universal and free. So already in the 1820s and 1830s, Americans were the best educated people in the world. And they've continued to be the best educated people, but we're slipping. And the reason I wrote the book is we are slipping, and we're slipping in three ways. And I talk about the human capital tripod in the book. We have to have the best education system in the world. For a very long time we did, but we're slipping there. We have to have the most advanced workplaces in the world, and we have to have people working in them. And again, we were leading in that. In fact, probably for the most part, we're still leading in that, but again, we're slipping. And then sort of our unique human capital resources that we've been much more not only open to having immigrants come to America. We're all the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants, but we also have been able to assimilate the immigrants and to create a unified people. So my book talks about how we can strengthen each leg of that human capital tripod.
Well, if we could just start right there. You said in all three areas we have been slipping. Is this primarily a policy problem or a political problem? Have Americans lost the will to be the world's smartest society? How have we moved in a wrong direction?
Well, I think that probably the greatest sin that we're guilty of is complacency. We've been so rich and so far advanced. The rest of the world, we thought we were sort of entitled to this position indefinitely. To some extent, some of the slippage is in absolute terms. A lot of the slippage, though, is relative. The rest of the world has not stood still. The rest of the world has discovered that the very things that made us great can make them great, too. Decades ago, Europe, recovered from the aftermath of World War II, and Europe has made great strides relative to where it was before World War II. But much to our surprise, places like China, and even to some extent India, are also making huge strides. So in this highly competitive 21st century world, you have to run faster and faster to stay in the same place, let alone to stay ahead. So if you wanted to know why we've been slipping, I would say the most, I think I'll give you two answers. The first, of course, is complacency, which I just mentioned. The other is we're confused as to what to do. What I try to do in my book is to lay out in a great deal of detail, backed up by statistics, by empirical data, those most useful things to do. One of the problems with the reform agenda, especially in education, it's too crowded. I call it an overgrown garden of reform plans, and they're killing each other. We can't do everything, and so we have to decide strategically which are the most constructive things to do. And what I try to do in the book is to indicate precisely those things in education that are going to be the most effective in the shortest amount of time and relative to other things would cost the least. None of them are going to be without cost, but these would be the most efficient ways of quickly regaining our footing in education. In the area of the work that I call the workplace, the second leg of the tripod, we've been very complacent about our research supremacy. We've been the leading country in research for decades, in fact, probably for well over a century. But again, we're complacent, and nickel and dime savings in Washington right now, partly as a result of partisan wrangling, are depriving us of the research and the technology we need to keep our industries in the forefront in the world. But the one thing which is really interesting, which is also part of that second tripod, is Americans are not working as much as they used to. And again, the reason for that is that we've made it more and more profitable for people not to work rather than to work. To me, that's a particularly frustrating policy area. And my only, explanation for it is that we somehow believe that there aren't enough jobs to go around, and people are doing us a favor by not working. And I argue strenuously against that the more people work, the better off they are, and the better off the country is. And finally, on the immigration front, the illegal problem has hugely distracted us and sort of, knocked us a little bit off course in terms of our traditional immigration policy. We shouldn't have been so complacent about allowing illegal immigrants, and it wasn't just the fault of the immigrants themselves, that American business, welcomed them with open arms, and the federal government, and this is in Republican as well as Democratic years, pretty much turned a blind eye to the phenomenon. And then all of a sudden we wake up and say, oh, look, we've got 11 million illegal immigrants. How did that happen? Well, I say we have to get that problem behind us, and we have to develop a strong, intelligent, human capital-based immigration policy going forward.
Talking to Peter Salins, S-A-L-I-N-S. Salins, is that how you pronounce it, Peter?
I say Salins.
Salins? Can I change it?
What?
Or do you mind if I change your name here?
Well, for the duration of the broadcast.
I understand. Salins, excuse me, S-A-L-I-N-S. The book is called, it's a fascinating book. It's called The Smart Society, Strengthening America's Greatest Resource, Its People. It's published by Encounter Books. I guess you can get it in bookstores everywhere. And
yes, you can, and you can get it online, and I think it's around $19, worth every penny.
If you do say so yourself.
Yes, I do say so. I'm kidding. I'm obviously kidding. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's you put a lot of time and effort and energy into this book and thoughts, so it is excellent. And thinking back through our country's history, it is amazing to think about the inventions that have come from Americans and that have changed the world in just, our little 200 and whatever it is, 40 years of existence.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's just, it's staggering. And it can't be, for any genetic purpose, because Americans are, as they say, the melting pot. So it must have something to do with the principles that our country was founded on, and the freedom and liberty and free enterprise and risk reward and all those things.
And the love of modernity. I mentioned that in my last book, too, in the Assimilation American Style, that Americans were the first and probably still are the leading modern people in the world. Most of the world is mired in tradition. Not that tradition is bad, but it does hold a lot of things back. And Americans were much more open to experimentation, to new ideas, to new things. In fact, Americans, by becoming Americans, were doing that. They were leaving wherever they were to come to the United States, which itself, especially in the 19th century, is a huge adventure, because the cost of travel in those days was horrendous, and America was very different than the places that most of our forefathers left. So Americans have always been open to modernity and change and risk. And there's a danger when you become a settled society that you lose that. And you either take it for granted or you're fearful of going further in that direction. And so I think we have to build on that strength. But one of the points I make in terms of the one aspect of that, technology is based on research. And in the 19th century, the technology, though it was quite amazing for the time, electricity and the radio and the telephone and, the Reaper and everything else that we developed in those years. But the scientific basis for it was relatively rudimentary. Now the new technology depends on much more complex science, and more complex science is more expensive science. On the other hand, on the scale of things that we spend money on in our society, science is your best possible investment. It's pennies compared to what we spend on income support, on the military, and even on paving roads. So but we do have to spend the money, in order to stay abreast of the science so that we can continue to plow ahead in the technology. And I make the point in the book that applied research is generally paid for by industry because it helps them to develop new products. But basic research, since it can't be patented and can result in any specific product, it is the basis for many, many products in many industries. Basic research has to be funded collectively, meaning by all of us. And so I argue that we should not let our basic research funding flag. We've actually been pretty far ahead in that game till only the last few decades, when, again, the sort of partisan wrangling in Washington makes this one of the casualties, partly because nobody realizes how important this is, because we're not talking about a lot of money.
You say we became the world's, we got about 2 minutes left, we became the world's richest nation by having the world's most educated citizenry. So does the opposite work as well? If we start losing our educational advantage, as we seem to have been doing, you've mentioned slipping, does that mean we're going to go the other way financially?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Both for individuals and society, there's this absolutely linear correlation between the level of education and affluence. If you look at Americans, forget about the super rich who may have gotten there through all kinds of unique pathways, but for the vast majority of affluent Americans, they're educated Americans. And the reason they're affluent is because they're educated. And the reason the country's affluent is because the country's educated. But again, the educational threshold keeps being raised. 100 years ago, an elementary education was enough. Half a century ago, a high school education was enough. Now you do need post-high school education, whether we call it college, whether we call it, technical school, or whatever you want to characterize it. We need to continue to move that frontier. But we're not going to be able to move that frontier unless we do a better job in our public schools, in our K-12 system. A huge number of Americans, even middle class, affluent Americans, children growing up in affluent families, aren't learning enough in school, and they struggle when they go to college. The really well-to-do make sure that these kids go to private schools or get tutors or whatever it is, and so they'll make it through. But for the rest of the American population, again, not just the poor, we really have to get much more aggressive in our